Every Saturday night, my son called me with the exact same question. Dad, are you alone? For months, I always told him the truth. I told him yes. But last Saturday, something felt wrong. The silence in my home sat heavy and wrong in a way I couldn't name. Some instinct I didn't understand made me hold back the truth. I said no. My neighbor had stopped by. That one split-second lie is the reason I'm still here. Welcome to Family Revenge Stories. I'm glad you're here with me tonight. If stories like this one speak to you, consider subscribing so you never miss one. It means a great deal. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Have you ever had someone close to you turn on you when you were most vulnerable? Drop a yes or no in the comments. I read everyone. One more thing before we begin. Some details in this story have been shaped for narrative purposes, and any resemblance to specific real individuals is entirely coincidental. It is the truth at the heart of the story that matters most. 40 years of raising warehouses, office complexes, and retail centers across the mid-Atlantic will teach you how structures are assembled, and more critically, how to spot when their foundations are giving way. My wife Lorraine passed 7 months ago. Since then, the sprawling suburban estate we'd built side by side felt less like a home and more like a hollow fortress. I'd poured everything I knew as a builder into these walls. I reinforced the framing. I poured the foundation myself and wired in the security systems with my own hands. That's precisely why I knew every sound this house was capable of making. At exactly 8 spr on a Saturday evening, the landline rang. I was sitting in my worn corduroy armchair, eyes fixed on a muted television screen. I lifted the receiver. It was my son Ethan. No greeting, no inquiry about my week or whether my arthritis was holding up against the winter cold. His voice was flat, clipped, drained of anything resembling warmth. Dad, are you alone? That was his ritual. Every Saturday night, regular as a clock, the same question. I was about to give my usual quiet yes when something caught my eye. Through the sheer curtains over the living room window, the motion sensor floodlight covering my driveway blinked on. A shadow, thick, fast, swept across the frosted glass. My chest went tight. 4 decades of construction instinct fired immediately. I know every inch of that perimeter. A wandering raccoon or a branch thrown by the wind doesn't reach the upper sensor on that fixture. Only a full-grown man does, Ethan asked again. His voice had sharpened, carrying a strange, breathless edge to it. I asked if you were alone, Dad. I glanced at the flickering light outside, then back down at the heavy plastic receiver in my grip. A cold knot settled in my gut. I lied. Actually, no, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Roy from next door stopped by, had a leaky pipe under the kitchen sink. And you know, Roy's stubborn retired army mechanic can't walk past a busted fitting without fixing it. He's staying for a couple of beers. A beat of absolute silence fell across the line. Then I heard a sharp intake of breath. Before I could ask Ethan what was wrong, the call dropped. He just hung up. No goodbye. No tell Roy I said hello. Just the hollow drone of a dial tone ringing in my ear. I set the receiver back in the cradle. My mind started moving fast, threading together dots I'd been deliberately leaving unconnected for months. Those weekly calls hadn't come right after Lorraine died. For the first 4 months of my grief, Ethan had barely been in contact at all. He and his wife, Tara, were busy booking vacations and upgrading the vehicles on their lease. The Saturday night calls began the very month Lorraine's life insurance payout landed, a substantial amount deposited cleanly into my primary trust. I remember clearly how Ethan had shown up at my door just 3 days after that deposit cleared, pacing through my kitchen, demanding a sizable loan to rescue his sinking private security firm. I'd turned him down flat. I had worked 18-hour shifts and paid cash for his entire college education so he wouldn't begin his adult life carrying debt. I wasn't going to drain Lorraine's last safety net to cover his reckless business decisions. He'd left furious, seething. And since then, all I'd heard from him was this weekly, unsettling ritual. Dad, are you alone? The sudden violent shatter of breaking glass yanked me back to the present. It came from the rear of the house, the heavy sliding patio door. My heart slammed against my ribs, but 4 decades on loud, dangerous job sites had taught me to lock panic in a separate room. I didn't call out. I didn't reach over and switch on the living room lights. I moved quietly through the dark hallway, stepping only along the far edges of the floorboards, where I knew the custom oak would stay silent. I closed my hand around the thick rubber grip tactical flashlight from the top closet shelf. I eased forward toward the kitchen archway, keeping my breath shallow and controlled. The bitter mid-Atlantic winter air was pouring in through the broken safety glass of the patio door. Standing squarely in the center of my kitchen linoleum was a figure dressed head to toe in black tactical gear. Tall, heavily built, completely still, just listening to the dark house. He must have caught the faint crunch of my boot, catching a loose shard of glass, because his head snapped toward the shadowed hallway where I stood. Before he could move toward me, the deep, unmistakable growl of a heavy-duty work truck's engine rolled in from outside. Roy pulling into his driveway right along my property line. The wide sweep of headlights raked across my kitchen walls, catching the intruder's face for a fraction of a second. He panicked, working from the assumption that Roy was heading straight through my front door, exactly as my lie had implied. He let out a vicious, strangled curse. He lurched backward, boots skidding and slipping wildly over the broken glass. In his scramble to get back through the shattered doorframe, his elbow caught the edge of my butcher block kitchen island hard. Something metallic rang out against the tile floor. He didn't stop for it. He cleared the patio. Railing crashed through the frozen shrubbery and vanished into the dense tree line along the back of the property. I didn't go after him. I held my position in the freezing dark, listening for any sign of a second man. The wind moaned through the broken doorframe. I made no move toward the wall phone. An elderly widower calling in a fleeting shape in the night would get a patronizing response from local dispatch. They'd send a young officer to do a cursory sweep of the yard and file me away as a confused, anxious old man. I needed to understand the precise nature of what had just come through my house before I involved anyone. I clicked on the thick rubber grip tactical flashlight and directed the beam at the kitchen floor. Resting beside the broken safety glass was a small black leather pouch, fallen open where it had struck the tiles. I knelt down, ignoring the glass, pressing into my knee, and picked it up. Inside sat a high-end precision electronic lockpick and bypass set. The tools gleamed under the beam alongside a digital decryption fob designed specifically for defeating commercial-grade deadbolts. I know commercial security hardware. I spent a career installing it in corporate buildings. This was not the rough, improvised kit of some opportunist looking to grab a television. I turned the leather pouch over in my hands. I recognized the manufacturer's logo pressed into the material, a highly restricted proprietary brand, the exact brand of advanced security hardware that Ethan exclusively distributed and sold through his failing firm. The freezing air flooding through the wrecked kitchen suddenly felt like a secondary concern. What was running through my veins was something colder entirely. My own son hadn't been calling to check on me every Saturday. He'd been calling to clear the target. I didn't reach for the phone. I stood still in my kitchen, the leather pouch in my grip. I knew precisely how a 911 call would unfold. A tired dispatcher would pick up. I'd report a shadow in the yard and a shattered patio door. 2 officers would eventually roll up my driveway, sweep a light through the bushes, and ask whether I'd taken my medication tonight. They'd look at the gray hair, look at the empty house, and generate a report about a grieving widower mistaking the wind for an intruder. I could not afford to be handled like a fragile old man. My son had just dispatched a professional to breach my home, and I needed to know what else had been touched before I alerted anyone. I left the kitchen dark. I moved through the house, on memory alone, following corridors I could have navigated blindfolded. The front door was perfectly secured. The guest bedroom windows were locked tight, but as I approached the heavy oak door leading down to the basement, a sharp metallic scent hit the back of my throat. Faint at first, half hidden beneath the cold draft, still bleeding in from the broken patio glass. I stepped closer, and the smell thickened, fast coating my tongue with the unmistakable sickening taste of raw natural gas. My heart hammered, but I forced my breathing to slow. I didn't touch the wall switch. I didn't even click on my thick rubber grip tactical flashlight. 4 decades as a commercial contractor, wiring massive warehouses, pouring foundations for industrial complexes, had hammered the absolute laws of hazardous materials into my bones. A single spark off a cheap light switch, or a hair of static discharge from a flashlight button in a gas-filled space, would ignite a pressure wave capable of leveling the entire property. I gripped the wooden handrail and went down the stairs in complete darkness. The smell hit suffocating levels by the time my boots met the concrete floor. My eyes burned, and my lungs fought every shallow breath I took. I moved my hands along the cold cinder block wall, navigating by touch, alone toward the utility closet where the main furnace sat. When my fingers found the thick iron pipes feeding the unit, I traced them downward to the primary shutoff valve. My stomach dropped out. The heavy brass lever, the one that requires real deliberate force to move, had been wrenched all the way open. This wasn't a slow seep from an aging fitting. That valve had been forced to maximum output on purpose. The man who came through my patio door hadn't been after my television or Lorraine's jewelry box. He had come to drown the foundation of my home in lethal gas. If Roy hadn't pulled his heavy-duty work truck into his driveway when he did, that man would have finished what he started. If I had simply drifted off to sleep after Ethan dropped the call, I would never have woken up. I wrapped both hands around the brass lever. 40 years of hammers and concrete have left my hands thick and calloused, but the valve was brutally stiff. I planted my boots hard against the concrete floor, ignored the oxygen burning out of my lungs, and forced that lever back until it locked firm in the horizontal shutoff position. The hiss of escaping gas died instantly. I found my way to the high basement windows by feel. I unlatched them and drove the heavy glass panes outward, letting the freezing midnight air pour in. I leaned against the damp concrete wall and pulled clean air into my chest in long, desperate pulls. The cold bit into my skin, but it kept me anchored. It kept my thinking sharp. As the toxic air bled out of the space, my eyes adjusted to the thin threads of moonlight falling through the open windows. That faint glow reached a corner I had kept deliberately concealed behind stacked cardboard boxes and old winter coats. The boxes had been shoved carelessly aside. Sitting fully exposed on the concrete floor was my heavy fireproof document, safe. I crossed to it, a cold dread settling in where the adrenaline had been. The thick steel door was slightly ajar. I crouched on the cold floor and studied the digital keypad. No scratches on the metal face, no pry marks around the hinges. Nobody had gone at the locking mechanism with a crowbar. The security indicator on the keypad glowed a steady, faint green, meaning the correct passcode had been keyed in by hand. Only 2 people in this world knew that sequence of numbers: me and my son Ethan. I pulled the steel door wide and reached inside. That safe held the essential architecture of my life, and I didn't need a light to know what was gone. My fingers moved over familiar stacks of old tax returns and vehicle titles, but the thick manila folder that always sat squarely on top was missing entirely. That folder held the original deed to this house. The property is fully paid off, carrying a current market value of $1.2 million. Beside the deed had been an even more dangerous set of papers: the comprehensive medical proxy and enduring power of attorney forms. Lorraine had insisted we have them drafted when she first fell ill. Those documents were written to hand the holder complete legal authority over my health care and financial affairs, should I ever become incapacitated. They were meant to be an emergency safeguard for our family. I settled back on my heels, hands resting on my knees. The full weight of the betrayal came down on me like something heavy and suffocating. Ethan's weekly calls had never been about worrying over a lonely old man. He was confirming my isolation. He waited until he knew I was alone, then dispatched someone carrying specialized tools to breach my home. Force the gas valve open and clean out my safe using the combination I had handed to my only child. Ethan had always been underwater financially. I paid his entire college tuition in cash, working overtime on brutal job sites so he could enter adult life without a dollar of debt. I believed I was giving him a foundation. What I had actually done was feed a deep sense of entitlement. He came to see my sacrifices as simply what was owed to him. His wife, Tara, was driven by status, always pushing him toward luxury cars and country club memberships that were well beyond their means. When Lorraine died and her life insurance policy deposited a substantial sum into my trust, Ethan had come to my door immediately demanding it to prop up his sinking security firm. My refusal hadn't closed the matter. It had simply made him change his approach. If gas had filled the house and I'd gone quietly in my sleep, Ethan would have inherited everything without a single complication. But the break-in had been cut short by my neighbor. The intruder had bolted before the job was done, leaving behind a wrecked patio door and a wide-open gas valve as unmistakable evidence of foul play. I rose slowly, my joints protesting the cold concrete. Ethan was desperate, but he wasn't careless. He and Tara were calculating people. Once they realized the trap had failed, they wouldn't fold and disappear. They had my original deed and the medical proxy in their possession. They held the legal keys to everything I owned. They would adjust. They would construct a new play to legitimize those stolen documents before I could reach my attorney or the authorities. I climbed back up the wooden stairs, leaving the basement windows open to push out the remaining foul air. I went to the living room and dropped heavily into my worn corduroy armchair. I didn't sweep up the broken glass in the kitchen. I didn't board up the shattered door. I sat in the freezing dark, watching the wall clock move toward morning. I knew precisely what was coming. They would need a story. They would need to establish that the old man living alone had finally come apart. I didn't close my eyes once. I waited for sunrise, fully prepared for the ambush I knew would arrive with it. The headlights of a large black luxury crossover raked across my frosted front windows at exactly 7 in the morning. I hadn't slept a second. I sat motionless in my worn corduroy armchair, waiting in the freezing dark of the living room. The heavy oak front door came open with a sharp click. Ethan still had a spare key from the days when I actually believed a father could trust his son. He shoved the door open and came in fast, Tara right behind him. Their performance had been worked out in advance. Ethan breathed hard, raking his hands through his hair to sell blind panic, while Tara clutched her designer handbag against her chest and turned wide, frightened eyes around the room. "Dad, are you okay?" Ethan called out, his voice bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. He came into the living room and stopped cold when he found me sitting in the chair. We drove straight over. "You sounded completely confused on the phone last night. You were rambling about shadows and broken glass, and then you just hung up on me." The lie rolled out of him without a seam. He was actively rewriting the history of our phone call to lay the groundwork for my supposed mental decline. Before I could say a word, the cold draft bleeding in through the ruined kitchen door carried the faint metallic trace of natural gas into the room. Ethan went still. His nostrils flared and his eyes went wide in a performance of horror. "Oh my God, do you smell that?" Tara pressed her manicured hand over her mouth and stepped back toward the front door, as though she might faint. Ethan didn't wait for any answer. He charged past me and threw the basement door open, thundering down the wooden stairs. I sat and listened to his boots on the concrete below. He was heading straight to the utility closet to play the hero. A minute later, he came pounding back up, gripping the heavy pipe wrench I kept on the workbench. His face was red with manufactured outrage. "Dad, you left the main furnace valve wide open," Ethan shouted, driving the wrench down hard on the coffee table. The metal cracked against the wood. "You flooded the basement with gas. If we hadn't come over here this morning, you would have blown yourself apart. You could have taken the entire neighborhood down with you." I looked at the heavy pipe wrench, then I looked at my son. Opening a commercial-grade gas valve requires significant, deliberate physical torque. A frail, disoriented old man does not accidentally crank one open while fumbling for a light switch. Ethan knew that perfectly well. He knew I had spent 40 years on commercial job sites handling hazardous materials. I understood how to lock down a structure better than almost anyone alive. But he needed this version of events. He needed me to be a danger to myself. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call him a liar. I simply let my shoulders drop forward, performing the precise exhaustion he was expecting. "I don't remember touching the valve," I murmured, keeping my eyes fixed on the floorboards. Tara moved in immediately, reading her moment to spring the psychological trap shut. She crouched beside my chair and laid her cold, perfectly manicured hand over mine. She wore a thick, cloying perfume that made the air feel immediately smaller. "Curtis, you have to admit that things have been slipping," Tara said, her voice laced with a sickening manufactured tenderness. "Ever since Lorraine passed, you haven't been yourself. We see it. The neighbors see it. The grief is simply more than your mind can carry. You are forgetting conversations. You are leaving doors unlocked. And now this. You almost killed yourself today." Hearing her speak Lorraine's name felt like a fist against my sternum. Lorraine had always seen straight through Tara. Before the cancer took her, Lorraine had warned me that Tara's expensive appetites and relentless social climbing would eventually push Ethan into a corner he couldn't get out of. Lorraine told me to guard the estate because Tara saw our savings as her personal inheritance to collect. I had brushed the warning aside out of a stubborn wish to keep the family intact. Now that peace was being turned into a weapon against me. Ethan stepped up alongside his wife, the two of them forming a physical wall between my chair and the front door. He reached inside his coat and drew out a thick, glossy brochure. He dropped it on the coffee table right beside the pipe wrench. "We can't let you go on living like this," Dad Ethan said, folding his arms across his chest. "It's completely reckless to leave you alone in this enormous house. We found somewhere. It's called Pinecrest Manor. It's a premier memory care community. Around-the-clock security doctors on staff, people your own age to spend time with." I stared at the brochure. It showed smiling elderly residents playing cards in a sunlit room. I knew exactly what kind of place Pinecrest Manor was. It was a high-security restrictive ward built for patients with advanced violent dementia. Once a person was committed and signed their rights over, the facility sealed its doors and kept residents heavily medicated to ensure compliance. An expensive holding pen for the inconvenient. "You need to come with us right now," Tara said, standing and smoothing her coat. "We can't risk leaving you here for another hour." Ethan crossed to the front door and pulled a large canvas duffel bag from the hallway closet. He dropped it on the floor. The solid thud told me it was already packed. "We put a bag together for you last week, Dad. We knew this day was coming." "Just your comfortable clothes and your toiletries?" The violation embedded in those words settled over the room like a cold fog. They had been inside my house while I slept. They had gone through my bedroom drawers, selecting my clothes and assembling the luggage for my imprisonment. They had been coordinating my removal for weeks, probably finding it laughably simple. Every instinct I had sharpened over 40 years of managing hard, unforgiving construction crews screamed at me to get out of that chair and push them both into the freezing street. I wanted to take Ethan by the collar and force him to look me in the eye and own what he'd done to that gas valve. But the cold, disciplined contractor who lived behind my eyes seized full control. If I erupted, they would call the police without hesitation. They would show the officers the open valve, the wrecked patio door, and the pre-packed bag. They would point at my rage and label it a violent dementia episode. The police would transport me to a hospital for a mandatory psychiatric hold, and Ethan would walk away with emergency control of my estate. I would be handing them precisely the outcome they had engineered. I needed time. I needed them out of my house so I could get to my attorney. I buried my face in both hands. I made my breathing hitch and shudder, projecting the image of a shattered old man who had just glimpsed his own unraveling. "I'm so tired," I whispered, letting my voice break just enough. "I'm just so tired of being alone in this big house without Lorraine." Tara smiled. A quick, triumphant flicker she couldn't quite suppress before her face reset into its mask of false sympathy. "I know, Curtis. We are going to take care of everything now." I lowered my hands slowly and looked up at Ethan with wet, hollow eyes. "I'll go with you," I said quietly. "I know I can't stay here anymore, but please, Ethan, give me one last day. Let me spend a day walking through these rooms and saying goodbye to your mother. Give me Sunday to gather a few of her photographs. You have my word as your father. I will drive myself to the facility tomorrow morning and sign the voluntary admission papers myself." Ethan shifted his weight, glancing uneasily at Tara. He clearly wanted me in the car that moment, but a voluntary admission changed the legal landscape entirely. If I walked through those doors and signed the paperwork willingly, they wouldn't need to grind through a court battle to prove my incompetence. A voluntary surrender was the cleanest and most profitable result for them. Tara gave him a barely visible nod. She was convinced she had broken me completely. She believed the sudden crash of self-recognition had extinguished whatever will I had left to resist. "Okay, Dad," Ethan said, his voice dropping into a thick, patronizing register. "You can have today, but we are calling the facility to expect you at 9 tomorrow morning. If you aren't there, we are coming back with an ambulance, and we won't be asking." I nodded slowly, folding further into my worn corduroy armchair. "Thank you, son." They turned and walked out the front door, pulling it firmly shut behind them. I listened to their footsteps crunch across the frozen driveway. I listened to the engine of their large black luxury crossover turn over and fade down the suburban street. The moment their tires disappeared entirely from earshot, my posture snapped upright. The trembling old man was gone. I rose from the armchair and walked straight to the large oak bookshelf that dominated the far wall of the living room. Tara had spent far too much time admiring my antique book collection on her last visit here. I reached behind a thick leather-bound encyclopedia, and my fingers met cold, hard plastic. I pulled it free, a tiny high-definition wireless camera, streaming directly to a remote server. They had planted it to watch my movements and document my supposed deterioration. I didn't smash it. I didn't hurl it across the room. I walked calmly to the television stand, reached behind the heavy wooden cabinet, and ripped the primary internet router cable clean out of the wall jack. The green indicator light on the camera died. The house sat dark and bone cold, but inside my head, everything was burning with absolute clarity. They wanted to strip away the empire I had built with my own hands. They were about to learn exactly who had built it. I grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter and headed for the front door. I needed to see Conrad. I didn't waste a single moment. I pulled on my thick canvas field coat, picked up my keys and the black leather pouch of lockpicks from the kitchen counter and walked out the front door, turning the deadbolt behind me. The freezing morning air hit my face hard as I climbed into my truck, but I barely registered it. The panic they had counted on was gone, replaced by something cold and mechanical. I drove the icy suburban roads toward the commercial district, not to a hospital and not to the police. I was heading for the one man whose brand of ruthless pragmatism matched exactly what I needed. Conrad worked out of a downtown high-rise office. He was a corporate attorney who had spent his career in asset protection and hostile takeovers. I had known him for 30 years. We had hammered out brutal union contracts together and steered commercial real estate deals through some genuinely ugly terrain. Conrad was a shark in a tailored suit, and he knew my mind didn't slip. I walked past his receptionist without stopping, ignored her greeting, and stepped directly into his private office. Conrad glanced up from his dual monitors, eyes narrowing as he read my posture. No handshake, no pleasantries about his family. I reached into my coat pocket and dropped the black leather pouch onto his mahogany desk. It hit with a solid metallic thud. Then I laid the glossy Pinecrest Manor brochure right beside the lockpicks. Conrad studied the tools, then the brochure, then my face. He didn't ask if I was all right. He reached out and picked up the leather pouch, turning it over to examine the proprietary logo of Ethan's security firm stamped into the leather. Then he opened the brochure and read through the restrictive committal policies of the memory care ward. His jaw set hard. Without a word, he turned back to his monitors and started typing fast. I lowered myself into the heavy leather guest chair and watched him work. The only sound in the room was the sharp percussion of his keyboard, while he moved through the encrypted portals of my trust and estate files. My mind wandered back to the financial sacrifice I'd made for my son. I thought about the grueling 18-hour shifts, pouring concrete in the dead of summer, framing warehouses through brutal winters. All of it to pay cash for every credit hour of the college education Ethan received. I refused to let my son step into adult life dragging student loan debt behind him. I wanted to hand him a clean start. But sitting in that quiet office, I understood that my greatest sacrifice had been a catastrophic miscalculation. A clean slate only meant Ethan never felt the grinding weight of money earned through hard physical labor. It taught him that resources simply materialized when he needed them. He didn't see my life savings as something I had bled for. He saw it as his own delayed inheritance. Conrad stopped typing. He leaned toward the screen, his eyes moving across a digitized document. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of cold professional fury. He turned one of his monitors to face me. He didn't cushion it. "Curtis," he said, his voice pulled down to a dangerous quiet, "your son did not just break into your house to frighten you. He accessed your safe to steal your medical proxy." Conrad pointed to a timestamp on the screen. The document had been electronically filed with the county clerk at 9:00 on Friday morning. Ethan had used the emergency clauses that Lorraine and I had drafted together years earlier. But he hadn't merely filed the paperwork. He had attached a preliminary medical addendum declaring me temporarily incapacitated and unfit to manage my own financial affairs. My chest tightened, but I kept my breathing even. The architecture of the trap was clicking into place with cold precision. I asked Conrad what Ethan was using the proxy to reach. My liquid assets were shielded behind dual authentication, but the proxy handed him sweeping emergency authority over the physical estate. Conrad opened a secure tab connecting directly to the commercial lending division of my main branch bank. He brought up a pending transaction that made the room tilt. Ethan wasn't going after whatever cash sat in my checking account. He had used the stolen medical proxy to initiate a massive commercial equity loan against my house. The property was fully paid off free of any liens carrying a current market value of $1.2 million. Ethan was moving to extract $800,000 in raw cash against the estate. Conrad pulled up the destination routing numbers attached to the pending loan. The funds were not earmarked for any care account tied to my supposed medical condition. They were designated for a direct corporate injection into Ethan's security firm. The business was completely bankrupt. He was buried in commercial debt, and he was using my home as collateral to drag himself clear of total financial ruin. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking. Ethan had opened that gas valve not only to kill me, but to ensure the property would transfer to him without complication. When his hired man failed and the gas leak surfaced, he and Tara moved immediately to their fallback. They needed to have me locked inside a restrictive memory care ward, heavily sedated before the bank finalized the loan. If I was sealed inside Pinecrest Manor, I couldn't take a call from a loan officer. I couldn't walk into a bank branch and demonstrate that my mind was sound. I would be completely neutralized while they bled the equity out of the home I built with Lorraine. Conrad looked at me steadily. Curtis, the bank requires a final in-person signature to release an equity loan of this size, even with a medical proxy on file. The deadline for that signature is Wednesday. The timeline clicked into place with horrible clarity. Today was Sunday. Ethan and Tara had demanded I surrender myself to the facility by Monday morning. They wanted me out of the house and chemically sedated so they could physically compel me to sign the final bank documents while I was under heavy medication. They were engineering a hostile takeover of my entire existence, and they were running on a ruthless deadline. Conrad picked up his desk phone. He asked whether I wanted him to call the police department and file immediate charges breaking and entering fraud elder abuse. I looked at the lockpick sitting on the desk. A straight arrest for a botched break-in would not strip Ethan of the power of attorney. He would retain a defense lawyer, argue the proxy had been filed out of genuine concern for my deteriorating mind, and tie my assets up in probate for years. An arrest would only cut him. I didn't want to cut my son. I wanted to dismantle everything he had built against me the same way he was trying to dismantle everything I had built for myself. I reached across the desk and gently pressed the phone down, killing the dial tone. I told Conrad the police would only freeze the board. I instructed him to quietly draft an irrevocable blind trust, moving every asset I owned completely beyond Ethan's reach. Before Conrad could agree, the silence of the office cracked open with the sharp ring of my cell phone. I drew it from my pocket. It was Tara demanding to know why I wasn't answering my landline at home. The psychological pressure campaign was still running, and I had to play my role without a single false note. Conrad turned the monitor back toward himself. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, pulling up the closing documents on the commercial loan Ethan had initiated. The screen threw a hard light across Conrad's tight jaw. He looked at me and said the bank had flagged the transaction. A loan of $800,000 against a fully paid-off property required a final in-person signature from the primary deed holder. Conrad tapped the screen. The deadline for that physical signature was Wednesday at noon. The timeline snapped into sharp, brutal focus. The shattered patio door and the open gas valve Saturday night had been Plan A. If I had died, the house would have transferred to Ethan cleanly. When I survived, they shifted without hesitation to Plan B. Sunday morning, they arrived with the Pinecrest Manor brochure, demanding I hand over my freedom by Monday. If I was confined inside a high-security memory care ward, heavily sedated, and officially declared incompetent by their corrupt doctor, Ethan would activate the stolen medical and financial proxies. By Tuesday, he would hold absolute legal guardianship. Wednesday morning, he could walk calmly into that bank and sign the equity loan documents in my name. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair. The full weight of it arrived, and with it came the memory of Lorraine. In her final days in hospice, her breathing had been shallow and labored. She had held my hand with a grip that surprised me. She told me to watch our son carefully. She said Tara carried a hunger for status that nothing would ever satisfy. Lorraine warned me that Tara's appetites would eventually pull Ethan under, and if I wasn't vigilant, Ethan would push me down to stay above water himself. I had let those words go, chalk them up to the worry of a dying woman. I had wanted to believe in the core decency of the boy we raised together. Lorraine had seen the rot working through his foundation long before I ever caught the smell of gas. Conrad reached for his desk, phone again. He pressed me to call the authorities immediately. He wanted to bring the police to the house, show them the forced valve in the basement, and have Ethan arrested for breaking and entering. I moved his hand away from the receiver. I told Conrad that calling the police was a tactical error. A simple arrest on a property damage or trespassing charge would yield almost nothing. Ethan would be out on bail before dark. Beyond that, an arrest wouldn't automatically cancel the medical proxy he'd stolen from my safe. He could lawyer up and claim the break-in was a desperate, love-driven act, a frightened son checking on a father lost to severe dementia. The courts would tie up my assets for months, while attorneys wrangled over my mental competency. I'd be buried in a grinding legal purgatory, while Ethan bled my accounts dry paying his defense team. I needed a weapon that didn't involve police at all. I needed a permanent, unbreakable wall. I directed Conrad to draw up an irrevocable blind trust. Every piece of the estate and every liquid asset I owned, I wanted it transferred into a corporate holding company, total and absolute. I told him to structure it so the holding company answered solely to the trust, making my personal signature worthless at any bank on earth. Even if Ethan managed to haul me before a notary and press a pen into my fingers, whatever he got me to sign would be void by law. He couldn't borrow against a house I no longer held title to. Conrad nodded slowly, absorbing the sheer finality of what I was proposing. He warned me that building an irrevocable trust of this scale in 48 hours meant calling in every member of his legal team. He also cautioned that once executed, I would surrender direct personal control over my own property. I told him to get it done. 40 years of my life had built that wealth, and I was willing to lock every last dollar of it away permanently if it meant cutting my son off from it. Before Conrad could even ask about beneficiary details, the stillness of the office cracked open. My cell phone jolted in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the lit screen. It was Tara. She was supposed to think I was sitting frozen in my living room, too rattled and confused to think straight. I took the call and brought the phone to my ear without saying a word. Tara's voice cut through the speaker, sharp shaking with brittle urgency. She demanded to know where I was. She said she'd been calling the house landline for 20 minutes and gotten nothing. There was no concern threaded through her tone. It was the hard-clipped cadence of a warden who'd noticed an inmate was missing from their cell. She was tightening the leash, trying to pin my exact location and confirm that her campaign of psychological isolation was holding. I steadied my breathing. I let a faint tremor creep into my voice, just enough to project complete defeat. I told her I was wandering the local hardware store hunting for plastic sheeting to cover the broken patio door. I said the house was freezing and I couldn't get my thoughts together. Tara let out a long theatrical sigh of irritation. She told me to go straight home and stay there. She said that roaming around town in my condition was precisely why she and Ethan were moving me to Pinecrest Manor tomorrow. She promised to send someone to fix the door, then ended the call without ceremony. I set the phone down. She hadn't called out of worry. She'd called to confirm I was still on the leash. Conrad looked across the desk at me, fingers resting above his keyboard. The war had moved out of the shadows and into open daylight. I told Conrad to finish the trust right away because my family was about to lock me in a cage, and I had to spring the trap before they got the door shut. I pressed the phone back to my ear and held my silence. Tara didn't bother with a greeting. Her voice filled the speaker, drenched in a cloying, artificial sweetness that turned my stomach. She said she was just calling to make sure I was safe. She told me that seeing me so frightened and confused that morning had broken her heart, and that she and Ethan were only trying to do what was best for the family. I didn't bite. I didn't raise the gas valve or the broken glass. I simply asked what she wanted. Tara released a soft practice sigh. She mentioned she'd been on the phone all morning making some very difficult calls. She said that out of concern for my physical safety, she'd taken it upon herself to contact my bank and my neighbors, specifically mentioning Roy next door. She told me she had warned them all about my severe dementia episodes. She said she'd instructed them to keep a close eye on me and to dismiss any alarming stories I might tell, because my mind was slipping rapidly and I was prone to vivid paranoid hallucinations. She was cutting my lines one by one. She was cinching a psychological tourniquet around my entire life, making sure that if I called out for help, every person within reach would chalk it up to the sad delusions of a broken old man. She told me to stay inside and rest until they came to collect me in the morning. Then the line went dead. I put the phone down. Conrad watched me from behind his mahogany desk. I told him I had to leave and that the blind trust needed to be ready for my signature before sundown. I walked out of the high-rise building and got into my truck. The cold logic of a man who'd spent his life in commercial construction told me I couldn't operate on assumptions. I needed to test how much of the cage Tara had already assembled around me. I needed to know precisely what damage she'd done to my resources. I drove straight to the main branch of my bank, a broad, solid structure of brick and glass anchored on the corner of the commercial district. I knew that building in my bones. 30 years ago, I ran the construction crew that broke its ground. I oversaw the concrete pours and the framing of the reinforced vault. I'd known the bank manager Clifford since his days as a junior loan officer fresh out of school. We'd shared cigars at his promotion party. When Lorraine was diagnosed with cancer, Clifford had personally arranged the financial structure to cover her medical bills. I walked through the sliding glass doors, expecting the familiar, warm acknowledgement from the staff I'd known for years. Instead, the security guard at the front desk went rigid the moment he spotted me. His hand moved to his radio. I went straight to the teller counter and laid down my identification. I asked to withdraw $5,000 in cash from my primary checking account. I needed liquid money funds that sat entirely outside Ethan's digital reach. The young teller scanned my ID and her eyes flicked anxiously toward her screen. She didn't open her drawer. She told me to wait one moment and hurried toward the back offices, glancing back over her shoulder, as if I were someone to be afraid of. 2 minutes later, Clifford came through the glass corridor. He didn't offer his hand. His shoulders were rounded, his face arranged into an expression of deep, uncomfortable pity. He steered me gently away from the main counter toward his private office, moving with careful, measured steps. When the door closed behind us, he didn't offer me a chair. He stood behind his desk and looked at me the way you look at someone you expect to shatter. Clifford spoke slowly, spacing out every syllable as though he were talking to a fragile child. He told me he'd received a very troubling call from my daughter-in-law that morning. He said Tara had forwarded an emergency medical addendum claiming I was in violent cognitive decline and posed a serious risk to myself and those around me. I kept every trace of emotion out of my voice. I told Clifford I was standing right in front of him. I reminded him we'd played golf 3 weeks ago. I told him I needed my money and that Ethan and Tara were manipulating the system to hollow out my accounts. Clifford looked down at his polished shoes. He said his hands were tied. The medical proxy Ethan had filed had automatically triggered the bank's internal emergency elder protection protocols. The system had frozen all large outbound transfers and kept my physical cash withdrawals at the bare minimum. He said he could authorize a maximum of $200 enough for groceries and basic necessities. He told me it was for my own protection until medical professionals could assess my condition and confirm my competency. I stood there and looked at him. This man had known me for 3 decades. He'd watched me manage multi-million-dollar commercial accounts without a single mistake. But one phone call from a calculating woman and a forged document had wiped out 30 years of my reputation in his eyes. The bank I had built from bare dirt was now holding my own money hostage. I didn't argue. Arguing would only cement the story Tara had so carefully planted in his head. If I raised my voice or brought my fist down on that desk, Clifford would summon the security guard and log my behavior as aggressive. I nodded slowly and swallowed the humiliation whole. I told him I understood the protocol. I asked for the $200. Clifford counted out the thin sheaf of 20s and placed them in my hand. His eyes were heavy with pity. He told me to take care of myself, Curtis, and said he hoped the doctors could bring me some peace. I walked out of his office and back through the glass doors into the bitter afternoon cold. This was something far more dangerous than a straightforward theft. Ethan and Tara weren't simply after my house. They were strangling my capacity to fight. By turning the banking system into a weapon, they had effectively cut off my financial air supply. I couldn't retain outside help. I couldn't pay for emergency transportation or a hotel room. A millionaire reduced to $200 in a coat pocket. I got back into my truck and wrapped both hands around the steering wheel. The cold leather steadied me. Tara believed she had put me in checkmate. She figured that cutting me off from my neighbors and freezing my accounts would drive me to surrender quietly to the facility transport come morning. She was convinced she'd dismantled every defense I had. What she didn't grasp was that she had just handed me the precise dimensions of the battlefield. They had sealed the perimeter, but I was still inside the walls, and I had tools they couldn't begin to anticipate. I turned the engine over and put the truck in gear. I had to get back to the house. The trap was fully laid, and I needed to be sitting at its center. When they arrived to trigger the final mechanism, my silence would no longer read as the stupor of a broken man. It would be the bedrock of their complete destruction. I pulled away from the bank and worked my way through the icy suburban streets. The stark reality of that $200 against my thigh drove home the full brutality of what Ethan and Tara were executing. They were cutting off my oxygen one line at a time. I turned onto my street and eased off the gas. A dark blue compact sedan was sitting carelessly against the curb in front of my house. A young man in a thin gray suit and a cheap overcoat stood on the frost-covered lawn. He was trampling Lorraine's dormant rose bushes, holding a digital camera to his face, and shooting pictures of my roofline. I pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. The hard crunch of my boots on frozen gravel made him spin around, nearly fumbling the camera into the snow. I read him in an instant. Pure, undiluted fear. A legitimate bank appraiser moves with quiet, professional composure. They book an appointment in advance and wear credentials on a lanyard around their neck. This man looked like a cornered animal. I crossed the driveway and closed the gap between us. I asked him plainly what he thought he was doing on my property. He swallowed hard and stumbled over his words. He said his name was Perry, and that Ethan had sent him to appraise the house for an upcoming equity loan. I held back the immediate impulse to grab him by the lapels and march him straight to the street. I needed to understand exactly which phase of the operation Ethan was running. I smoothed my expression. I pulled on a wide, easy smile, the harmless, slightly confused old man delighted to have company. I told Perry it was far too bitter out here in the wind. I invited him inside for a hot cup of something warm before he finished his work. He hesitated, glancing toward his car, but the cold made the decision for him. We stepped into the foyer, and I swung the heavy oak door shut, throwing the deadbolt with a sharp final click. I walked him into the kitchen. The metallic bite of natural gas had completely cleared out, replaced by the sterile chill of house, quietly bleeding its heat. Perry clutched a thick leather clipboard hard against his ribs and refused to surrender his coat. I watched him the way a construction foreman watches an apprentice he already knows is lying. I moved to the coffee maker and filled 2 mugs. I asked Perry how long he'd been working commercial appraisals. He shifted his weight and claimed 5 years. I handed him a steaming mug and settled back against the butcher block island. The dissection began. I asked how he factored a commercially rated poured concrete foundation into his current valuation. I mentioned almost offhandedly that I'd sunk a reinforced steel skeleton beneath the main floor to carry the load of the large cantilever deck out back. I asked his opinion on the current market adjustment for high tensile steel joists set against standard residential timber framing. Perry stared into his mug like it held the answer. He attempted a bluff. He mumbled something vague about standard load-bearing wood supports and basic residential finishes. He used entirely the wrong vocabulary, calling a primary structural section a decorative pillar. I let him talk, listening quietly while he dug himself deeper. 30 years running large construction sites had trained me to identify a fraud inside 30 seconds. Perry knew absolutely nothing about architecture or property valuation. He was a proxy, a hired hand dispatched by Ethan to move a hidden agenda forward. I pressed on, letting the silence between questions expand and bear down on him. I asked whether the bank typically required a full structural soil test for an equity loan on a property this close to a natural municipal watershed. The question was entirely fabricated. Perry went pale. Sweat gathered at his hairline despite the cold draft still seeping through the house. The psychological weight of impersonating an expert in front of the man who had literally built the structure, was cracking him open. Perry set his mug on the counter with an unsteady hand. He asked if he could use the restroom before he started measuring interior square footage. I pointed him toward the long, dim hallway. He nearly fled the kitchen, desperate to get out from under the questioning. In his scramble to break eye contact and escape the room, he made a critical mistake. He left his thick leather clipboard lying flat on the kitchen island. I waited until I heard the bathroom door shut and the lock click into place. I didn't hesitate for a single second. I stepped over and flipped the heavy leather cover open. My eyes went straight to the top document. There was no corporate bank logo, no appraisal metrics, no property valuation grids. It was a dense multi-page legal contract. I read the bold print stamped across the top of the page. It was an expedited commercial estate liquidation agreement. The designated buyer was a major regional property development corporation, one widely known for leveling residential lots to throw up cheap commercial strip malls. The designated seller was Ethan, acting as sole legal executive of the estate under an activated medical proxy. The equity loan Conrad had uncovered was nothing but a calculated smokescreen. Ethan had never intended to simply borrow against the house to rescue his failing security firm. He was planning to erase my legacy entirely. He had already negotiated a fast cash deal with a corporate developer, sell the land for a fraction of what it was worth. Ethan wanted immediate liquid cash, and he was prepared to let a bulldozer flatten the home where he grew up to get it. I scanned the execution dates at the bottom of the contract. The sale was set to finalize the precise moment my commitment to Pinecrest Manor was processed by the county court. Ethan needed me locked inside that high-security memory care ward and declared legally incompetent by Wednesday morning so he could trigger the demolition of my property by Wednesday afternoon. The sound of the toilet flushing and carried down the hallway. I closed the leather cover quietly, leaving the clipboard exactly where Perry had set it down. I stepped back and picked up my mug, drawing a slow sip of the dark liquid. Every trace of shock at the betrayal had burned away. In its place settled something else entirely, a cold glacial clarity that reached all the way to the bone. Perry came back into the kitchen, looking marginally steadier after putting water on his face. He scooped up his clipboard and managed a weak, shaky smile. He said he had everything he needed for the preliminary report and would let Ethan know the property was in excellent shape. I gave him a pleasant, unhurried nod and said goodbye. I stood in the foyer and watched the young fraud push through the front door and practically sprint to his dark blue compact sedan. I threw the deadbolt and stood alone in the silence. The financial stranglehold at the bank and the forced committal were just mechanisms scaffolding erected to support the real theft. Ethan was going to bulldoze my entire history the moment they sealed a padded door behind me. Protecting my assets was no longer sufficient. I had to make the trap impossible to escape. The sun had barely scraped above the frozen horizon on Tuesday morning when the deadbolt on my front door turned with a sharp metallic snap. I was sitting in my usual worn corduroy armchair in the same position I'd held since the fake appraiser walked off my property the day before. The house was completely still. I listened to heavy boots scraping snow off the welcome mat. Ethan came through the foyer, and he hadn't come alone. A man in a rumpled tan suit followed him in, carrying a thick medical briefcase. Ethan moved into the living room, rubbing his palms together against the cold. He looked at me with a carefully constructed expression of pity. "Dad, this is Dr. Voss," Ethan said, keeping his voice low and gentle as though he were settling a spooked animal. "He's here to look in on you and make sure you're holding up after everything that happened this weekend." I studied the man standing beside my son. Dr. Voss did not carry the calm, grounded presence of a legitimate physician. His suit was cheap and badly fitted. His eyes moved around my living room, sweeping across the antique furniture and the vaulted ceilings with a hungry, calculating energy. He didn't offer a proper introduction, no handshake, no medical identification card. He simply drew a plastic pen from his breast pocket and clicked it twice. "Hello, Curtis," the doctor said, his tone so thickly patronizing it made my skin tighten. "Ethan tells me you've been having a very difficult time lately. He says you've been confused, forgetting things. We just want to ask you a few simple questions to get a sense of how your mind is working today." I kept both hands resting flat on the armrests. I didn't blink. I told him to go right ahead. Boss clicked his pen again and dropped his gaze to a form on his clipboard. Can you tell me what year it is, Curtis? He asked, drawing out each word with exaggerated care. Do you know who the current president is? Can you describe what you had for breakfast this morning? The questions were designed to demean. We just want him to be safe and calm when he goes to his new home. They moved toward the front door boots, clicking across the hardwood. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't look back. Ethan pulled the heavy oak door shut behind him, and the deadbolt drove home with a dull, heavy thud. I sat alone in the living room and listened to their engine turn over and recede down the street. They were convinced they had run a flawless operation. They had cut me off from my neighbors, severed my financial access, arranged a fraudulent medical committal, and secured heavy narcotics to reduce my mind to fog. Tonight, they would drug me into a walking coma. Tomorrow, they would drag me out of my own home. I rose from my worn corduroy armchair. My muscles were tight from holding the performance together, but my mind burned with absolute clarity. Ethan thought he was a master tactician working a broken old man. He had no idea he was an amateur strolling straight into a detonation. I walked to the kitchen and picked up my truck keys. I had an appointment with Conrad, and I was going to execute a financial maneuver so complete that my son would never recover from it. The time for pretending had run out. The heavy steel deadbolt on the rear utility door scraped back with a dull metallic grind. I didn't go out the front. I knew Ethan would have eyes on the street, watching to see whether his sedatives had already taken hold. I stepped out into the frozen shadows of the backyard. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind drove straight through my thick canvas field coat, but I barely registered the cold. The simmering rage had burned itself out, replaced by something cooler and far more precise. I pushed through the dense frozen brush along the property line. Thorns raked my face and caught on my jacket. I kept my gaze fixed on the gray smoke curling from the chimney of the house next door. Roy had lived beside me for more than 2 decades. Tara had cheerfully announced her attempt to poison his opinion of me just hours earlier. She wanted me completely surrounded by closed doors. I stepped onto his wooden back porch and knocked twice on the frosted glass. Roy appeared a moment later in a thick knit sweater, a steaming mug cradled in both hands. He pulled the door open and looked at me. There was no pity in his face, none of the fear Tara had tried to plant there. I didn't give him time to ask anything. I looked my old friend straight in the eye. I told Roy that my son was moving to steal my home and commit me to a psychiatric ward, and I needed his car right now to stop it. Roy held completely still for 3 long seconds. He didn't see a confused old man spinning in dementia delusions. He saw the man who had hauled him out of a flooded basement during the severe spring storms 10 years ago. He set his mug on the counter and reached into his pocket. He brought out a set of keys and pressed them into my palm. He didn't ask for a single explanation. He just told me the tank was full and to bring it back when the job was finished. I took the keys and went around to his driveway. I got into his old sedan and turned the engine over. I kept to the icy back roads, staying well clear of the main commercial avenues, where Ethan might be watching. I drove to a nondescript brick office building on the industrial edge of the city. Conrad was already inside, waiting in a bare ground-floor conference room. A private notary sat quietly at the far end of the long wooden table. The table was buried under thick stacks of legal documents. Conrad didn't bother with pleasantries. He slid the first heavy stack across the polished surface. He explained that this was the irrevocable blind trust. By signing these pages, I was legally transferring full ownership of my entire estate, liquid cash, physical properties, everything into a corporate holding company. The holding company would answer entirely to the trust. My personal signature would be rendered worthless to any bank or commercial lender on earth. I picked up the heavy brass pen. I didn't hesitate for a moment. I signed my name across the thick paper in clean, steady strokes. A deep sense of liberation settled over me as the ink dried on the final page. I was willingly surrendering the empire I had spent 40 years assembling to make certain my enemy could never lay hands on it. Conrad slid the last document forward. It was the absolute beneficiary designation form. He told me I needed to designate in legal terms where the assets would go when I eventually died. I looked at the blank line. I did not write my son's name. I wrote the precise legal title of a state charity dedicated to housing and educating abandoned children caught inside the foster care system. Conrad paused and looked at me, but he said nothing. I stared at that name, and my own brutal past came flooding back. I remembered the freezing concrete floors of the state-run group homes. I remembered being 15 years old and sleeping with my boots laced tight to my feet, because the older boys would strip them off in the dark. I had clawed my way out of a merciless childhood through sheer force and refusal to quit. When Ethan was born, I swore he would never know that kind of terror. I constructed a fortress of wealth to keep him from everything that had broken me. I handed him the soft, protected existence I had always wanted for myself. But sitting in that stripped-down conference room, I saw the fatal error in all of it. I had shielded him from hardship, but I had also kept him from developing any real character. I had raised a predator who read my unconditional sacrifice as weakness. The wealth I had bled to build would now go to children who knew exactly what it cost to survive in the cold. The private notary stamped the final page, collected his materials, and left the room without a sound. The financial perimeter was airtight. Ethan could haul me to any bank and force a pen into my hand, and every document he got me to sign would be legally worthless. But Conrad didn't look like a man who had just won something. He leaned forward and laced his fingers together, elbows on the table. He told me the trust protected my money, but it did nothing to protect my physical body. What we had just executed was entirely defensive. Conrad laid it out plainly. Ethan still held the forged medical proxy and the fraudulent narcotic prescriptions from that corrupt clinic. If Ethan managed to drug me tonight and funnel me into a medical transport van tomorrow morning, things would unravel badly. Conrad warned me that once the locked doors of a high-security memory care ward closed behind me, getting me out through legal channels would take months. Ethan would use my chemically sedated condition as definitive proof of my supposed advanced dementia. He would drain whatever personal funds I had left, fighting Conrad through probate court, while I sat strapped to a bed staring blankly at a white ceiling. The holding company would save the house, but I would lose my mind. A quiet legal win was no longer sufficient. If I simply disappeared and checked into a motel, Ethan would file a missing persons report within the hour. He would trigger a statewide alert framing me as a dangerously disoriented elderly man loose in the frozen streets. The police would track me down and hand me straight back to him. I couldn't run. I couldn't fight him behind closed doors. I had to let him spring the trap. I had to let him bring the transport team and the chemical restraints directly into my living room. I needed to break my son openly in front of the very authorities he had been trying to turn against me. I needed to engineer a confrontation so catastrophic that his carefully maintained mask shattered in plain sight of everyone. I pushed back from the conference table and slid the brass pen toward Conrad. I told him to keep his phone within reach tomorrow morning and be ready to move the moment I gave the signal. I walked out of the brutalist office building and got back into Roy's old sedan. The sun was dropping below the tree line, throwing long, dark shadows across the snow. I had to get home and swallow the poison my son was bringing me. I parked Roy's old sedan 2 streets over and covered the rest of the distance on foot, slipping through the dense row of pines along the back edge of my property. The frozen snow crust crackled softly beneath my boots. I moved with deliberate care, keeping low behind the tall privacy fence until I reached the back patio. The temporary plywood patch Ethan's hired man had hammered over the shattered glass offered nothing in the way of real security. I eased inside without a sound and threw the deadbolt. What you're about to hear is the moment the ground shifted beneath everything I thought I understood about my own family. Before I get there, let me ask you this. If someone you loved deeply had been quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you found out? Or would you watch and let them finish digging their own grave? The house was completely silent, but an unfamiliar warmth pushed out from the kitchen. I stood motionless in the shadowed hallway and listened. The steady rhythm of a knife against a wooden cutting board carried down the corridor, followed by the hiss of butter hitting a hot pan. The smell of roasted garlic and simmering beef broth reached me rich and savory, and it pulled up a memory from 12 years ago with startling clarity. Tara had been a nervous 22-year-old, anxious to make a good impression that first Thanksgiving with our family. She had asked me to show her how to make Lorraine's famous beef stew. I had stood in that same kitchen guiding her hands as she worked through the vegetables, telling her exactly when to add the garlic, so it wouldn't scorch. I had believed we were laying the groundwork for something like a real family. Now she was at my stove using the very recipe I gave her to cover the chemical taste of my captivity. I crept down the hallway without a sound, pressing my back against the wall until I reached the narrow gap of the kitchen door. Tara was at the butcher block kitchen island, humming something tuneless under her breath. She wore a white, pristine apron over her expensive merino sweater. Two steaming bowls of dark, thick stew sat waiting on the counter. I watched her through the crack in the door. The humming stopped. She reached into her apron pocket and produced a small plastic prescription bottle, the exact one Ethan had obtained from that corrupt clinic doctor just hours before. She worked off the child-proof cap and shook 3 thick white pills onto the cutting board. She didn't pause for a second. She brought the flat side of a meat tenderizer down hard and crushed the pills into a fine chalky dust. She swept the powder from the board with the edge of her knife and scraped it directly into my bowl of stew. She took a silver spoon and stirred it thoroughly until the narcotics had dissolved completely into the thick broth. Then she wiped down the counter, rinsed the cutting board, and dropped the empty bottle in the trash. She had carried out the poisoning with the calm, practiced efficiency of someone seasoning a pot of soup. I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway and released a loud, deliberate cough. Tara went rigid. I stomped my boots against the hardwood, mimicking the slow, heavy tread of an exhausted old man coming in through the front door. I walked into the kitchen with my shoulders rounded and my eyes half closed. Tara spun around instantly, arranging her face into a mask of glowing, artificial warmth. "Curtis," she said, her voice drenched in forced cheer, "I didn't hear you come in. I let myself in. I knew you had to be cold and hungry after wandering around all day, so I made your absolute favorite." I looked at the steaming bowl she slid across the island toward me. The roasted garlic buried everything else underneath it. I gave her a weak, unsteady smile. "That's very kind of you, Tara," I said, keeping my voice low and fragile. "I'm just so tired." I lowered myself heavily onto a wooden bar stool directly in front of the poisoned bowl. Tara settled across from me and sipped from her own untouched portion. Her eyes stayed on me, steady, unblinking. She needed to see me consume the drugs. She needed visual confirmation that the chemical submission was taking hold. I picked up my spoon and dipped it into the broth. I raised it halfway to my mouth and stopped. I squeezed my eyes shut and let out a sharp, ragged cough. I doubled forward, hacking hard against my fist, letting my breathing catch and stutter. I grabbed the edge of the butcher block island as if I couldn't steady myself. Tara was on her feet immediately, her chair scraping back against the floor. "Curtis, are you all right?" she asked, her voice going tight with sudden alarm. She wasn't concerned about my health. She was afraid a medical emergency might throw off the carefully timed committal process set for tomorrow morning. I wheezed, pointing a trembling finger toward the refrigerator. "Water," I forced out, letting my voice crack. "Please, Tara, a glass of cold water." Tara turned her back to me and moved quickly to the refrigerator, pulling the heavy stainless steel door open. The instant her line of sight broke, my trembling hands moved with total precision. I reached into my coat pocket and brought out a large gallon-sized plastic Ziploc bag I had prepared at Conrad's office. I held it beneath the lip of the counter and emptied the entire contents of the poison bowl straight into it. I sealed it without a sound and pushed the heavy sloshing bag deep into the inner pocket of my thick canvas field coat. I wiped the bowl clean with a paper napkin and tucked that into my pocket alongside the bag. Then I picked up my spoon and scraped it loudly against the empty ceramic surface. Tara turned back around with a glass of ice water in her hand. She looked down at the clean bowl, and something behind her eyes relaxed with profound relief. She handed me the water and watched as I took a long, slow drink. "You must have been absolutely starving," she said, her voice dropping back into that syrupy cadence. I nodded slowly, letting my chin sink toward my chest. "I think I ate too fast," I mumbled, softening my words into a slur. "I feel very heavy, Tara." I let my eyelids fall completely shut. I leaned forward, dropping my elbows onto the island, and let my head sag against my forearms. I drew my breathing down to a slow, deep rhythm, simulating the sudden, crushing onset of heavy commercial narcotics. I let every muscle go slumping across the counter like a puppet whose strings had been cut all at once. Tara didn't ask if I was all right. She made no move to help me up. She stood where she was and watched my chest rise and fall. She waited a full 60 seconds to be certain the sedation had taken completely. When I still hadn't moved, I heard the soft rustle of fabric as her hand dipped into her apron pocket and retrieved her cell phone. The kitchen was absolutely still broken, only by the quick tap of her fingernails against the glass screen. She was composing a message. My eyes stayed closed, but my hearing was razor sharp. I caught the faint electronic swoosh of the text being sent. "He's out," she murmured to the empty room, her voice completely stripped of its artificial warmth. Nothing left but cold clinical satisfaction. I heard her footsteps carry her away from the island. She moved into the hallway, and a moment later I caught the soft sound of her dialing. "Ethan," she said, her voice low and urgent. "The doctor's prescription worked perfectly. He's completely under. He's practically comatose. Bring the final transport papers over right now. We don't need to wait until tomorrow morning. We can move him tonight while it's dark and nobody's watching." I stayed slumped across the butcher block island, my face pressed against the cool wood. They were pulling the timeline forward. The trap was closing hours ahead of schedule. But what they didn't know was that the man they believed was unconscious was fully awake and holding the very evidence that would take them both apart. The final act was about to begin. I kept my eyes shut and let my arms hang completely limp toward the floor. Every muscle in my neck and back went slack. To anyone looking in, I was a helpless old man flattened by a massive dose of sedatives. But beneath that carefully built physical performance, my mind was running at full speed. I tracked the sharp, rhythmic click of Tara's heeled boots against the hardwood. She moved out of the kitchen and went straight down the hallway. She wasn't looking for a blanket to put over me. She wasn't calling to check on the medical transport Ethan had arranged for the morning. She was heading for the master bedroom. The heavy oak door creaked open. I heard dresser drawers being yanked out and shoved back in with hard, impatient force. Then came the soft metallic clink of a heavy latch. She had found Lorraine's antique jewelry box. I lay motionless against the counter, listening to the desecration of my late wife's most private possessions. Tara came back out into the living area. I heard the heavy wooden box meet the glass surface of the coffee table with a dull thud. She exhaled long, slow, completely unguarded. It was the sound of a predator standing over something it had just taken. "I'm taking these," she announced to the empty room. Her voice held none of the sugary warmth she performed when Ethan was present, raw and trembling with undisguised, shameless avarice. She addressed the air, but every syllable was pitched loud enough for the groggy old man slumped in the kitchen to absorb. She needed him to know she had won. Gold and silver chains scraped against velvet as she dragged them free, one compartment at a time. 30 years of birthdays and anniversaries reduced to inventory. Her fingers found the emerald brooch I had given Lorraine for our 20th anniversary. A sharp, involuntary breath. She lifted it into the light like a trophy. "You never deserved any of this." Tara muttered, the dry scrape of diamonds against her palm filling the silence of the house. "You and your pathetic, dusty little life sitting in this massive house while Ethan and I drown in debt. It is completely unfair. We are the ones who have a future. We are the ones who know how to live." A fistful of heavy rings clunked into her purse. The jewelry was only the opening act. The real prize was still coming. "I hope they keep you heavily medicated in that facility." She continued the measured click of her heels, tracing a slow circuit across the living room rug. "Ethan feels guilty, but he is weak. He does not understand what it takes to survive in the real world. By tomorrow afternoon, this entire property will belong to the commercial developers. They are bringing the bulldozers next month. They are going to wipe this miserable monument to your dead wife right off the map." Each sentence was a blade aimed at the center of my chest. She wasn't just stealing, she was erasing me, auctioning off the wreckage of my life to pay for her own. A soft laugh slipped out of her, arid and pitiless, rising toward the vaulted ceiling. "I'm going to buy a beautiful new house in the hills," she breathed. "I'm going to completely forget you ever existed, Curtis." Then her footsteps pivoted, heading back my way. She was coming to see what the drugs had done. I ground my cheek harder into the butcher block surface and held absolutely still. Her heels stopped, inches from where I sat. A dense cloud of floral perfume enveloped me, thick enough to blot out the smell of the beef stew pooled across the counter. She loomed over me, letting a long, terrible silence stretch between us. Cold, polished fingertips found the side of my neck. Pulse check. She had to verify that the narcotics she'd ground into my bowl hadn't simply killed me outright. A corpse in the kitchen meant a mandatory investigation, a medical examiner, a toxicology screen, all of which would expose the lethal concentration of illegal sedatives in my system within hours. She required a living, breathing signature on those final commercial bank documents in the morning. The moment her fingers bit into my carotid artery, every nerve in my body screamed to recoil. Human wiring runs deep, and enemy's touch triggers the heart to lurch muscles, to tense adrenaline to flood the bloodstream. But I was not merely a retired commercial contractor. Decades before I ever negotiated a concrete pour or stared down a hostile union, I had been a teenage infantryman fed into a brutal, unforgiving jungle war. I knew what it was to lie face down in black rainforest mud, while enemy patrols moved within 10 FT of my position. One wrong breath in those dark, suffocating hours cost you everything. That war had taught me to splinter my consciousness away from my flesh. It taught me to pull air in sips so shallow my ribs never visibly shifted. More than that, it had drilled into me a specific method of controlled breathing that could drag my heart rate down by force, thinning the blood's surge through my veins to something barely above a standstill. I reached back through decades of rust and retrieved that discipline with both hands. I poured my attention into the absolute darkness behind my eyelids. I bled the air slowly from my chest and let my pulse sink to a low, unhurried knock. Tara's fingers pressed harder, hunting for something that would tell her I was still functional. What she found was the torpid underwater rhythm of a man buried under sedation. Her hand dropped away, a barely audible exhale relief. "He's completely out," she murmured more to herself than anyone. She turned her back on me and moved toward the living room to finish picking through my wife's jewelry box. She owned this moment completely, or so she believed. A perfect operation, the manipulation, the theft, the poisoning, all executed without a single loose thread. She was certain she was the only one in this house who knew what was actually happening. But Tara was moving through this night entirely sightless. What she could not know was that 3 hours earlier, while she and Ethan were consumed with their fraudulent legal paperwork, I had not spent that time drifting. I had been alongside Roy. When I borrowed Roy's car to finalize the blind trust with Conrad, I had also pressed my old neighbor for a critical tactical favor. Roy had spent a full career as a security technician, threading wire through commercial bank vaults and hardening government facilities. He knew exactly what was needed. After I returned from Conrad's office, Roy came through my back door in the dark, a heavy black duffel slung over one shoulder packed with professional-grade surveillance gear. While Ethan and Tara mapped out my destruction, Roy and I were quietly gutting my living room and kitchen and rebuilding it around them. We moved fast and clean, the practiced efficiency of two men who grasped precisely what losing would mean. Roy had planted 3 separate high-definition micro cameras throughout the space. The first he threaded into the plastic housing of the kitchen smoke detector, angling the wide-angle lens straight down over the butcher block island. The second he buried in the hollowed spine of an encyclopedia on the living room shelf, perfectly sited on the coffee table. The third he anchored high in the ceiling's corner, molding its field of view, sweeping the full open floor, plan in one unbroken frame. These were not the sort of cameras that save footage to a local drive where it could be smashed or wiped. Roy had sourced military-grade optics, every frame recorded at a pristine 4,000-pixel resolution. He had then laced the whole network into an encrypted cloud server through an invisible cellular uplink streaming continuously. The footage was routing in real time to a secure digital vault that Conrad managed remotely from his downtown law office. Tara had no idea that the pinhole in the smoke detector directly above her had captured the precise second she crushed those illegal sedatives and raked the powder into my soup. The prescription label and frame, the slow stir of the spoon, the flat businesslike look on her face as she finished. She had no idea that the lens nested in the bookshelf was at that very moment transmitting high-definition footage of her hands, pushing my late wife's diamond earrings and emerald brooch into her designer purse. And the detail that would hurt her most, she never suspected Roy had run highly sensitive, omnidirectional microphones along the inside of the baseboards. Not a syllable of her monologue had gone unrecorded. The cloud server held clean, unambiguous audio of her announcing the commercial estate sale, laying out the demolition timeline, and stating plainly that she intended to flatten my home and fund her next chapter on the proceeds of my medical incapacitation. She had constructed the instrument of her own ruin and handed it to me voluntarily. I lay without moving on the kitchen counter, tracking the last thin metallic snap of the antique jewelry box latch. Tara's purse zipped shut around the stolen pieces. She came back through the kitchen one final time, heels sharp against the floor. She didn't spare me a glance. She lifted her thick canvas field coat from the hook, stepped through the front door, and turned the lock behind her. I waited until the sound of her engine dissolved somewhere down the frozen street, and then I let my eyes open. I pushed myself upright, deliberately working my shoulders loose, rolling the tension from my neck. My hand went into my coat pocket and came back with the sealed plastic bag, holding the poisoned soup, tangible, irrefutable proof to anchor the tampering charge. I tilted my face toward the smoke detector and gave one slow, deliberate nod to the lens watching from inside it. Conrad had the live feed running at his office. The poisoning was on video. The real estate conspiracy was on audio. The theft of the jewelry was captured in high definition. Ethan and Tara were planning to arrive the next morning, expecting to find a sedated, powerless old man they could walk out of his own home and drain of everything he had left. They were walking into a slaughterhouse, legal, financial, and absolute. The trap had been set. Every piece of evidence was locked away safely, and I was ready to bring my son's empire down on top of him. The pale flat light of early Wednesday morning spread itself slowly across the hardwood floor. I lay without moving, arranged heavily across the sofa's arm, exactly where I had dragged myself in the long, quiet hours before dawn. My body was arranged with deliberate care to replicate what a man looks like when narcotics have hollowed him out. Completely, posture caved, limbs surrendered, breathing trimmed down to the barest thread of air. The house held no sound at all until a heavy commercial engine grumbled to life at the curb outside, shredding the stillness. The vehicle sat, idling. Air brakes exhaled with a sharp, metallic hiss against the frozen morning. The medical transport had arrived on schedule. Boot heels crunched over the icy gravel of the driveway. A key found the front lock. The deadbolt gave way with a hard, final clack, and the oak door swung inward, dragging a blade of winter air through the foyer. Ethan and Tara came in together. No greeting, no performance of warmth, none of the hollow cheerfulness they usually deployed like a costume. With me apparently gone, the pretense had been discarded entirely. Tara's designer heels tapped a sharp rhythm across the floor. Ethan's winter boots landed with heavy, deliberate thuds. "He is exactly where I left him," Tara said, her voice stripped flat of anything resembling feeling. "The pills worked perfectly. He has been out cold all night." Their presence pressed in over me. Having my own son standing that close sent a primal alarm through my body, but I held my discipline without a crack. Eyes sealed, jaw hanging loose. Every muscle in my neck and across my shoulders deliberately drained of tension my body, nothing but slack, inert weight. "We need to get this done before the transport crew comes inside," Ethan said, his voice strung tight with frantic energy. "The bank needs these final equity loan documents, signed and notarized by noon. Bring the clipboard and the blue pen. Grab his other arm and help me pull him up." Tara's cold, manicured fingers closed around my left bicep. Ethan seized my right shoulder, a hard, graceless grip. There was no gentleness in it, no concession to fragility. They wrenched me upward, hauling my torso off the armrest and shoving me backward onto the center cushions of the sofa. I let my head loll and drop against the upholstery. I gave them nothing, no assistance, no resistance, forcing every pound of my weight onto them entirely. Ethan grunted loudly with the effort as he released me onto the cushions. "He is like lifting a sack of wet cement," he complained, panting. "He has always been too heavy. He eats garbage and sits in that chair all day. I'm going to throw my back out just trying to get him into the wheelchair." I sat slumped there, absorbing the contempt saturating my son's voice. 30 years ago, when Ethan was a small, tired child, I carried him up the steep wooden stairs of our first house every single night. I would ease him from the back seat of my truck, with both arms cradling his head, careful not to break his sleep. I bore the full weight of his world, without a word of complaint. I pushed through brutal hours in the freezing mud of job sites so he would never have to know what that kind of labor cost a man. Now he stood over me, mopping sweat from his forehead, and what he saw was not a father who had spent his body building something for his son. He saw dead weight, an obstacle between him and a large sum of money. The love was not merely absent, it had never existed in this version of him at all. He regarded my physical existence as nothing more than a fleshy inconvenience, blocking the path to his payday. "Just prop him up and get it over with," Tara hissed. "The transport guys are waiting in the freezing cold. We are paying them by the hour." Ethan grabbed the front of my sweater and hauled me forward, then jammed a thick decorative pillow behind my shoulder blades to prop my torso upright. I kept my chin dropped against my chest, my eyelids sealed. The hard, cool edge of a leather clipboard was pressed onto my lap. Everything was converging now. This was the moment Ethan had been constructing for months, the point where he would strip the accumulated weight of my life from my hands in a single transaction. He believed the signature he was about to manufacture would set the corporate demolition of everything I had built into irreversible motion. What he did not know was that Conrad had already filed the airtight, blind trust documents making the papers now sitting on my lap, nothing but legally hollow. I only needed to let the crime play out. I needed Roy's hidden cameras to capture the physical act of elder exploitation without interruption. Ethan took hold of my right wrist. His palm was slick with nervous sweat. He bore down on my knuckles, squeezing them together. He snatched a pen from Tara and wedged the barrel between my thumb and index finger. The physical calibration here was everything. Too much rigidity in my hand, and Ethan would know immediately I was conscious. Too much limpness, and the pen would drop, producing an illegible scratch that would raise flags at the bank. I had to simulate the exact muscular state of a heavily sedated man, passive enough to be guided just firm enough to leave a plausible mark. Ethan hunched over me. His breathing came in short, shallow pulls. The smell coming off him was stale coffee and raw adrenaline. He folded his hand over mine and locked down on my knuckles with a grip like a clamp. He drove the pen tip against the stack of financial documents and began to move my arm. "Just let me guide it," he muttered to himself, his focus tunneled completely inward. "Keep the pressure steady. Make the loops look like his old signatures." He dragged my hand along the bottom margin of the page. I felt the ballpoint rolling and catching against the heavy paper stock. He traced the jagged cursive shape of my full name by force, pressing hard enough to nearly cut through the sheet. He was not signing for me. He was wielding my hand as an instrument, conscripting my own body against my interests. He turned the page and drove my hand down to the next signature line. "This one is the admission form for Pinecrest Manor," he whispered, his voice trembling with dark excitement. "Once this is signed, they have complete medical custody. He cannot sign himself out, and nobody can visit him without my explicit written permission. We are locking the door and throwing away the key." He pushed my hand through the signature, sealing what he intended as my final entrapment, committing me by forgery to a high-security facility from which I would have no route back. He yanked the pen free from my fingers and shoved my arm aside. It dropped off the edge of the sofa, my knuckles striking the hardwood floor with a hollow knock. Ethan stepped back, raising the clipboard toward the morning light coming through the windows. I listened to the silence stretch across the room as he studied the forged signatures, verifying the theft, satisfying himself that the ink would hold up to scrutiny at the bank. Then he let out a sharp, sudden bark of laughter. It was not a normal sound. It was unhinged ringing with the pure arrogance of a man who had convinced himself he'd outsmarted the entire world. "We did it, Tara," Ethan said, his voice climbing, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. "Look at these signatures. They are absolutely perfect. The bank will authorize the wire transfer by the end of the business day." I heard Tara move toward him, the fabric of her coat shifting as she leaned in to examine the documents. "I knew this would work," she said, her tone thick with smug satisfaction. "I told you he was too weak to fight us. He is just a broken old man." He did not even know what hit him. Ethan slapped the clipboard hard against his thigh. He raised the papers and waved them in the air, savoring the total ruin of my life. "We are millionaires! Tara!" he declared, his voice ringing through the room with naked, shameless triumph. "The estate is entirely liquidated. The money is ours. Go open the front door and signal the transport crew. Tell them the patient is fully sedated and ready to be loaded into the van. Let's get this piece of garbage out of our house. The heavy steel door of the medical transport van slammed shut outside. The sound rolled down the quiet suburban street like a gunshot, marking the final act of Ethan's desperate scheme. I sat completely still on the leather sofa, holding the exact posture of a man flattened by heavy chemical sedation. My chin was pressed hard against my sternum, arms dangling perfectly limp at my sides. Every muscle in my body was fully slack, projecting the total illusion of physical defeat. The heavy front door of my house swung open. Bitter, freezing air swept into the foyer, followed at once by the chaotic shuffle of multiple heavy boots. I took in the sounds of the intrusion with absolute tactical precision. Ethan spoke first. His voice was a carefully engineered performance of grief. He sounded shattered, bone-tired, and utterly overwhelmed by tragic circumstance. "Please come straight through to the living room, gentlemen," Ethan said, his voice cracking flawlessly on the last word. "He's been completely unresponsive all morning. The doctor warned us the neurological decline would move fast, but we never thought it would happen this quickly. It just breaks my heart to see my father this way." I heard Tara step forward, her expensive boots clicking crisply against the hardwood. "We are just so incredibly grateful you could get here so fast," she added, her tone soaked in counterfeit maternal concern. "We were up the entire night, terrified he might turn the gas on again or wander out into the snow. We simply can't give him the level of medical supervision he needs anymore." The performance was revolting. They were selling the story of devoted, heartbroken children reluctantly surrendering their beloved patriarch to a specialized facility for his own protection. They needed these orderlies to believe they were carrying out an act of mercy rather than executing a corporate kidnapping. I heard the distinct rhythmic squeal of heavy rubber wheels rolling across the foyer tiles. The transport orderlies had brought the steel wheelchair. The metallic rattling grew louder as they steered the heavy chair down the hallway and maneuvered it into the living room. The wheels stopped directly in front of the sofa. The sharp mechanical click of the wheel brakes locking cut through the stillness of the room. "I'm sorry you have to go through this, sir," a deep, unfamiliar voice rumbled from across the room. It was the lead orderly. His tone was flat and purely professional. He was a man used to moving human cargo without asking too many questions. "It's never easy handing a family member over, but you're doing the right thing for his well-being. Where do you need us to position him?" "He's right here," Ethan answered, releasing a long, trembling sigh. "Please just try to be gentle. He's very frail, his bones are quite brittle." As I sat there feigning total sensory collapse, a sharp, bitter memory ignited somewhere in the back of my mind. I had watched Ethan deploy this exact same psychological mask of tragic innocence before the precise rhythm of his weeping, the trembling shoulders, the effortless manipulation of authority figures. It was a performance he had been perfecting for over 2 decades. I remembered a freezing rainstorm in late November. Ethan was 19 years old and had come home after flunking his first semester of college. I got a phone call from the highway patrol at 3 in the morning. Ethan had driven my heavy-duty work truck straight into a concrete retaining wall on the interstate. When I pulled up to the crash scene, the rain was falling in blinding sheets. The front axle of my truck was completely pulverized, the engine block wrapped tight around the concrete barrier. Ethan was sitting on the wet bumper of a police cruiser, reeking of cheap alcohol. A massive veteran state trooper loomed over him, holding a thick rubber-grip tactical flashlight directly in Ethan's face, getting ready to administer a field sobriety test. I stood in the pouring rain and watched my teenage son execute a flawless psychopathic maneuver. Ethan didn't act angry or combative. He didn't slur a single word. He simply looked up at that towering trooper and broke into violent, heaving sobs. He manufactured thick, desperate tears and let his whole body shake with fabricated trauma. Ethan told the officer he had been swerving to avoid a stray dog that darted into his path. He claimed he was so completely consumed by worry over his mother's failing health that he had suffered a massive, crippling panic attack behind the wheel. Lorraine was in perfect physical health at the time, but Ethan used her name as a human shield without a moment of hesitation or remorse. He wept with such terrifying conviction that the hardened state trooper actually lowered his flashlight and laid a sympathetic hand on Ethan's shoulder. The officer never administered a breathalyzer. He never wrote a citation for driving under the influence. He simply issued a minor warning for reckless driving due to hazardous conditions and told me to take my deeply shaken son home. When I drove Ethan away from that wreckage, his tears disappeared the exact second my car doors locked. He sagged against the passenger seat and let out a dry, arrogant laugh. He boasted about how absurdly simple it was to work the police. He bragged about his ability to cry on demand. Sitting in that dark car, listening to his cold laughter, I understood that I was entirely responsible for creating a predator. I had spent my whole life shielding him from the hard consequences of his choices, and he had learned how to turn human empathy into a weapon for his own survival. Now, 20 years on, he was putting that same psychopathic ease to work this time to erase me from existence permanently. The monster had never changed. He had simply found a more profitable target. The lead orderly let out a heavy breath. "He looks completely out," the man observed, eyeing my slumped posture. "Are you certain he's medically safe to transport without chemical restraints?" We gave him the exact dosage the clinic doctor prescribed. Tara cut in, quickly defending their fraudulent medication protocol. "He's very docile once the sedatives kick in. You just need to lift him securely under the arms. Once he's strapped into the chair, he won't put up any resistance." I heard the thick rustle of heavy canvas fabric. The orderly stepped directly into my personal space, and the sharp scent of sterile alcohol, wipes, and stale coffee rolled over me. I felt the heat of the man's large hand reaching down toward my right shoulder. Ethan stood just a few feet away, holding his breath completely. I could feel the intense vibrating anticipation radiating off his body. He believed he was seconds from total, absolute victory. He was certain his forged bank signatures had locked in the massive equity loan. He was certain the fake medical proxy had guaranteed my permanent institutional imprisonment. He truly believed he had successfully stolen my entire existence. The orderly's heavy hand clamped down firmly on my shoulder, preparing to haul my dead weight upward. I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp for air. I executed a deliberate, complete shift in my physical energy. I opened my eyes. I didn't blink groggily at the morning light. I didn't scan the room with the vacant, glassy stare of a heavily medicated victim. I locked my gaze directly onto the lead orderly and stared straight through him with glacial, absolute clarity. The orderly froze immediately. His fingers loosened their grip on my sweater. He recognized at once that the man sitting on this sofa was not in the grip of advanced chemical sedation or neurological collapse. The dead weight vanished entirely from my posture. I engaged my core and sat up perfectly straight, my spine rigid against the sofa's backrest. I moved with slow, deliberate precision. I reached up with my right hand and calmly adjusted my shirt collar, smoothing the wrinkled fabric flat. I brushed a small piece of lint from my knee. I set both hands flat against my thighs, fingers perfectly still. I didn't slouch. I didn't tremble. I sat with the rigid, commanding authority of a corporate chairman presiding over a hostile boardroom. "I won't be needing the chair, gentlemen," I said. My voice didn't slur. It didn't crack or waver with age. I pushed the words up from deep within my chest, letting them cut through the living room's silence like a heavy steel blade. The undeniable authority in my tone rang sharply off the hardwood floors. The lead orderly snatched his hand from my shoulder and stumbled back a quick step, nearly tripping over the metal footrests of the wheelchair. He stared at me in complete shock, then turned to fix a hard glare on Ethan. The carefully constructed fiction of the frail, confused dementia patient had evaporated in a single devastating second. Ethan stopped breathing entirely. The counterfeit tears dried instantly on his face. The mask of the grieving son was violently torn away, leaving nothing behind but a portrait of pure, undisguised panic. His eyes went wide as coins, staring at me as though I had just risen directly from the grave. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords failed him completely. Not a sound came out. He was completely paralyzed, locked, in the terrifying understanding that his chemical attack had spectacularly collapsed. Tara dropped her designer purse straight onto the floor. The heavy leather smacked against the wood, but nobody moved to pick it up. She stared at me, mouth hanging open, every drop of color draining from her face. The arrogant, triumphant woman who had gleefully ransacked my wife's jewelry box barely an hour before was replaced in an instant by a terrified animal caught in a trap with no exit. I stayed perfectly seated on the sofa. The hidden cameras mounted above the bookshelf and inside the smoke detector were silently capturing every fraction of their horror. Conrad was sitting in his downtown high-rise office, watching the live high-definition feed, waiting on my final command. The holding company owned the house. The charity owned the estate. The poison was sealed tight in a plastic bag inside my coat pocket. I looked straight into my son's panicked eyes. The silent reckoning was finished. The war he had waged from the shadows was over, and the complete public demolition of his entire life had officially begun. I turned to the lead orderly and kept my posture perfectly rigid against the sofa cushions. I told him to take his men and wait outside on the frozen front lawn. My voice stayed flat drained of any underlying emotion. I informed them that they had been brought in under entirely fraudulent pretenses by a desperate amateur attempting to execute a massive felony. The orderly hesitated, shifting his weight uneasily from one foot to the other. His eyes moved from my clear, unblinking gaze to the sweating, panicked face of my son. The medical transport crew was trained to handle combative dementia patients who thrashed and screamed. They were in no way equipped to handle a lucid corporate executive issuing calm legal warnings from a living room sofa. The lead orderly took a long, slow step back from the coffee table. He signaled his partner with a sharp jerk of his chin, and the two of them retreated toward the foyer. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the dark, catastrophic family implosion unfolding before them. The heavy front door clicked shut and left us entirely alone in the house. Ethan let out a strangled guttural sound of pure, unfiltered terror. He couldn't let the transport team leave the property. If I didn't get into the back of that medical van, his entire operational timeline would splinter into 1,000 jagged pieces. The commercial estate sale he had arranged would collapse immediately. The corporate bank would aggressively demand their money back. He lunged forward and seized me by the shoulders with both hands. They were shaking with such force that I could feel the tremors traveling down through my heavy sweater. He dug his fingers into my collarbone and tried to physically drag me off the sofa, meaning to force my body toward the steel wheelchair by sheer brute strength. He was breathing hard, muttering breathless, desperate curses under his breath. He ordered me to stand up. He demanded I stop destroying his life. He was no longer performing the role of the grieving son, reluctantly surrendering his beloved father. The mask had fully melted away, leaving nothing but a cornered feral animal clawing blindly for survival. I did not throw a punch. I didn't strike him or try to push him back. I simply planted my boots firmly against the hardwood floor and locked my core. I anchored my weight deep into the frame of the sofa. Ethan was 30 years my junior, but he had spent every year of his adult life sitting comfortably behind an office desk. He had no real functional strength to speak of. He yanked and pulled at my clothing, but he could not shift my center of gravity a single inch. I sat like a block of solid granite, while the greasy sweat streamed down his flushed red face. Tara stood frozen near the brick fireplace, clutching her designer purse hard against her chest, completely unable to understand how their airtight, covert operation had come apart so violently in a matter of seconds. Ethan pulled back his right fist, ready to drive it across my face in a moment of blind, raw frustration. Before his arm could snap forward, the heavy oak door in the foyer burst open with a massive, deafening crash. The sound of heavy tactical boots rang out rapidly down the corridor. Conrad walked straight into the center of the living room. He did not look like a friendly neighborhood attorney stopping by for a casual morning call. His face was set in a mask of absolute legal hostility. He hadn't come alone. Two tall men in dark tactical windbreakers followed close behind him, fanning out to cover the perimeter of the room. They wore heavy silver badges clipped to their belts, marking them as state fraud investigators. Detective Hagen, a veteran investigator I had known for more than 15 years, stepped in right behind them. He rested his hand casually on the radio clipped to his belt and swept the room with cold, calculating eyes. Ethan dropped his hands and stumbled backward, completely frozen by the sudden presence of heavy law enforcement. The air in the room thickened until it was nearly suffocating. The physical, imposing weight of the detectives crushed the remaining oxygen out of Ethan and Tara. They were completely trapped, with nowhere left to go. I turned my head and looked directly at Tara. Her eyes were darting frantically toward the hallway, but Detective Hagen was physically blocking the only way out. I spoke to her in a voice that stayed perfectly calm and level. I told her the beef stew she had prepared for me the previous night was an impressive culinary effort. I complimented her technique, told her she had ground the heavy sedatives into that thick broth with real skill. Tara went completely white. The color vanished from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a hollow, terrified ghost. Her jaw trembled hard, but she couldn't produce a single sound. I brought up the day she first came into our family. I told the quiet room how I had stood in that same kitchen 12 years ago, patiently showing her how to simmer the garlic and put together that exact recipe. She had taken a warm family memory and turned it into a weapon, converting my own kitchen into a poison laboratory. It was an intimate, visceral betrayal. I explained to the silent room that I had not swallowed a single drop of her contaminated meal. I had faked the coughing fit and emptied the poisoned soup directly into a plastic zip bag concealed in my lap. Exactly 24 hours ago, I handed that same sealed bag to a private courier. He drove it straight to an independent toxicology laboratory in the city. The chemical results had been transmitted digitally to Detective Hagen before sunrise this morning. The analysis confirmed a massive lethal dose of unprescribed commercial sedatives. I watched Tara's legs give out beneath her. She slumped hard against the brick fireplace and slid down until she hit the floor. The designer purse stuffed with my late wife's stolen jewelry slipped from her hands and fell open, scattering diamonds and gold chains across the living room rug. Conrad stepped forward and moved to the glass coffee table. He carried a thick leather folder tucked under his right arm. He brought it down onto the glass surface with a sharp, definitive crack that made Ethan flinch. Conrad looked at my son with absolute professional contempt. He announced that he was officially serving them with the executed, irrevocable blind trust documents. Ethan stared at the heavy stack of legal papers, entirely unable to process the devastating weight of what he was reading. Conrad gave him no time to collect himself. He laid out the legal architecture of my masterstroke with brutal, unforgiving precision. He explained that the house they were standing in no longer belonged to me. The property, the bank accounts, the commercial land, and all liquid assets had been fully transferred to a corporate holding company 24 hours prior. I did not hold a single fraction of the estate any longer. The sole legal beneficiary of the entire holding company was a state charity dedicated to housing and educating abandoned foster children. I had shielded Ethan from the harsh realities of the foster system I survived as a child, but now those very children would inherit the empire he had tried to steal. Conrad leaned over the table and pressed a manicured finger firmly against the documents. He looked Ethan straight in his panicked eyes. He explained the fatal, inescapable trap Ethan had walked directly into with both eyes open. The massive equity loan Ethan had illegally secured required the authentic signature of the primary property owner. Because the holding company now held legal title to the house, my personal signature was officially worthless. When Ethan physically guided my limp hand to sign those final bank documents, just 10 minutes ago, he had not merely committed standard financial fraud. He had transmitted a forged, unauthorized signature to a federally insured financial institution across state lines to secure a massive commercial payout. Ethan's knees visibly buckled. He grabbed the back of the sofa to keep himself from folding onto the floor. The full weight of what he had done swept across his face in a wave of absolute sickening terror. Conrad laid out the final consequences with no room for misunderstanding. By forcing my hand to sign that specific document, Ethan had officially committed massive federal wire fraud. It carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. The state fraud investigators stepped forward, drawing heavy steel handcuffs from their utility belts. The silent reckoning had finally landed, and my son was about to meet the brutal reality of the world he had made. Conrad stepped back from the glass coffee table, letting the sheer weight of the federal wire fraud charge crush whatever was left of Ethan's arrogant facade. The silence in the living room was suffocating. Detective Hagen moved forward, producing a small black digital tablet from his tactical windbreaker. He did not issue a verbal warning or read them their rights just yet. He walked directly to the large flat-screen television mounted above my brick fireplace, connected a short cable to the side of the screen, and tapped the face of his tablet. The television blazed to life, throwing a harsh artificial glow across the pale, terrified faces of my son and daughter-in-law. The screen showed the crystal-clear, high-definition footage Roy had secured from the smoke detector camera. It was completely irrefutable. The angle looked straight down onto the butcher block kitchen island. Tara gasped, stumbling backward in a panic as she watched her own image reach into the pocket of her white apron and pull out a plastic prescription bottle. The audio was flawless, capturing the heavy thud of the meat tenderizer, grinding the illegal sedatives to powder. The hidden microphones carried her exact words back into the living room with horrifying clarity. We watched on that massive screen as she swept the toxic white powder into the simmering beef stew and stirred it with cold mechanical detachment. Detective Hagen tapped the tablet, again switching the feed to the camera concealed inside the hollowed encyclopedia. The perspective shifted to the very room we were standing in. The television showed Tara violating my late wife's sacred jewelry box. Every diamond earring and heavy gold chain she forced into her designer purse was captured in sharp, brilliant resolution. Her cruel, arrogant monologue filled the air. She gloated about bulldozing my home and using my medical commitment to bankroll her new mansion in the hills. The sheer malice in her recorded voice stripped away any defense they could ever hope to raise in a court of law. Tara let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She dropped to her knees on the hardwood floor, clutching her head with trembling, manicured hands. She shrieked that the footage was manipulated as sophisticated digital fabrication, engineered by my lawyers to destroy her life. She looked wildly at the state fraud investigators, pleading with them to believe it was an elaborate setup, orchestrated by a bitter, vindictive old man. She swore she had only come to check on me and prepare one last warm meal. Detective Hagen didn't even blink at her frantic performance. He simply reached into his coat and unfolded a white document. It was the official toxicology report confirming the massive lethal dose of commercial narcotics found in the exact bag of soup I was now pulling from the deep interior pocket of my thick canvas field coat. I set the heavy plastic bag of contaminated stew onto the glass table, right next to the blind trust documents. Tara stared at the physical evidence, her eyes wide with pure terror. She began to hyperventilate, curling into a trembling, pathetic ball on the floor as the inescapable reality of her impending prison sentence came crashing down on her. Ethan was entirely paralyzed. His chest heaved as he stared at the television screen, understanding that his entire corporate empire and his personal freedom had just evaporated in a matter of seconds. I looked at him and felt absolutely nothing. The deep paternal love I had carried for 4 decades had been systematically burned away. I leaned forward and rested my hands firmly on my knees. I looked straight into my son's hollow, panicked eyes and began to methodically dismantle the foundation of his entire existence. I told Ethan he was a complete financial failure. I watched his face contort in shock as I stripped away the grand illusion of his self-made corporate success. For 10 long years, Ethan had moved through the city, convinced his private security firm was surviving on his own brilliant business instincts and hard-edged negotiating. I explained to the silent room that his company had gone completely bankrupt a decade ago. His reckless spending and fundamental inability to manage basic logistics had driven the firm into the ground before he even reached his 30th birthday. Every time he failed to land a major contract or botched his payroll, a silent, anonymous corporate holding company had injected emergency capital directly into his business accounts. I told him I was that anonymous holding company. I had quietly bailed him out month after month, year after year, paying his vendors, absorbing his massive debts, making sure he would never have to face the humiliation of public ruin. I funneled profits from my construction sites directly into his failing enterprise just to keep his fragile, arrogant ego intact. The realization hit Ethan like a physical blow to the stomach. His jaw trembled violently as the entire story of his life fractured into microscopic pieces. He had spent his whole adult life looking down at my rough hands, and my quiet, simple existence convinced he was vastly superior because he wore a suit and carried a briefcase. Now he finally understood that his luxury vehicles, his expensive tailored suits, and his prestigious corporate office had all been bought and paid for by the sweat and blood of the very man he was trying to destroy. He had built nothing of his own. He was a total parasite living entirely off the host he had set out to consume. Detective Hagen raised his hand and signaled the two state fraud investigators. They moved in with clinical, tactical precision. The sharp, metallic ratchet of heavy steel handcuffs cut through the sound of Tara weeping on the hardwood floor. An investigator grabbed Tara by her expensive merino sweater, hauling her up off the floor and wrenching her arms behind her back. The steel cuffs locked tight around her wrists. Detective Hagan seized Ethan and shoved him firmly against the back of the sofa, pulling his wrists together behind him and securing them with a heavy final click. Hagan read out the list of criminal charges in a loud, steady voice that rang off the vaulted ceilings. They were being arrested for felony elder, abuse breaking, and entering attempted poisoning and grand larceny. Conrad stepped forward and drove in the final nail, reminding them of the federal bank fraud charge for forging my signature on the corporate equity loan. Each individual charge carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a state or federal penitentiary. They were staring down decades behind concrete walls wrapped in razor wire. The commercial developers would not be acquiring the property. The bank would freeze every single asset connected to Ethan the moment Conrad filed the injunction. The total erasure of their future was absolute and inescapable. Their arrogant illusion of control had been completely inverted, and they were left with nothing but the crushing consequences of their own boundless greed. Ethan grasped the full magnitude of his destruction. His knees gave out entirely, forcing Detective Hagen to physically haul him upright by the collar of his winter coat. Ethan looked at me, and the arrogant corporate predator vanished on the spot. He reverted immediately to the exact same psychopathic performance he had executed as a teenager on the shoulder of that rainy highway. He began to weep violently. He forced thick, desperate tears down his flushed face, letting his whole body shake with fabricated trauma. He begged me to call off the police. He shrieked that he was deeply sorry, claiming the crushing stress of his failing business had driven him temporarily out of his mind. He swore he had never truly intended to hurt me, that he simply needed the money to survive. He strained against the steel handcuffs, lurching toward me with pitiful, naked desperation. "Dad, please, you have to stop them," he wailed, his voice cracking right on cue as he tried to weaponize my fatherly instincts one final time. "I am your son. You cannot let them lock me away in a cage. We are family. We are blood." I stood up from the sofa, rising over the weeping, broken man who had plotted to erase my entire history and reduce my legacy to rubble. The legal victory was firmly secured. The financial perimeter was permanently locked. The physical threat against my life was neutralized in cold steel restraints. I looked at the hollow artificial tears running down his face and felt absolutely no pity, no remorse. I did not raise my voice. I did not erupt in anger or take any satisfaction in his catastrophic downfall. I spoke only the bare, unvarnished truth, anchoring that final moment in something cold and impossible to escape. "You stopped being my son the night you turned that gas valve." Detective Hagen wrenched Ethan backward, hauling him forcefully toward the foyer, while his desperate sobbing collapsed into frantic, shrieking panic. Tara screamed hysterically as the state investigators dragged her out of the house, her designer shoes, scraping and catching across the floorboards. I stood perfectly still at the center of my living room and watched the heavy oak door slam shut for good, cutting the cancer cleanly out of my life. The silent reckoning was finished at last. The natural order had reasserted itself, and the house settled into quiet once more. The morning air carried a sharp winter bite that felt entirely clean, entirely untainted. It had been exactly 1 month since that heavy oak door swung closed behind the state investigators and the wailing protests of my son. I sat in the woven chair on my back patio, watching the first pale wash of sunrise bleed across the frosted tree line. The house at my back was completely pristine. Every room had been scrubbed down and returned to its natural quiet state. The clinging odor of heavy floral perfume and bitter, anxious sweat had been wiped out entirely. The toxic presence that had invaded my home was gone for good, leaving behind a solid, comfortable emptiness. I held a ceramic mug of black tea, letting the warmth work its way into my calloused palms. Roy sat in the chair beside me, blowing gently on his own steaming cup, Neither of us said much. We were two old men who understood the deep worth of a quiet, peaceful morning. The war had been waged entirely in shadow, and the victory it produced required no loud celebration. The aftermath of the silent reckoning had moved with the swift, flawless precision of a corporate demolition crew. The legal fallout came down in quick surgical strikes delivered by Conrad and his team of relentless litigators. The federal court froze every bank account tied to Ethan and his failing security firm within hours of his formal arrest. State marshals seized his luxury vehicles straight from the precinct parking lot. His prestigious corporate office was fully liquidated to cover the mandatory restitution he owed to swindled vendors and the government. Tara lost the sprawling modern house she had leveraged to the breaking point to bankroll her extravagant lifestyle. The bank foreclosed on her property the moment her husband was indicted on multiple federal fraud charges. Every material possession they had ever valued or paraded around was stripped away by the authorities. They were left with nothing but the cheap state-issued uniforms hanging off their backs in their holding cells. The medical board moved with equal, unrelenting ferocity. They permanently revoked the license of Dr. Voss, the corrupt clinic physician who had knowingly prescribed the heavy chemical sedatives. Conrad handed the federal prosecutors an encrypted digital trail that proved the doctor had accepted a massive cash bribe from Ethan to falsify my psychological evaluation. Voss was now facing his own serious federal indictment for his active role in the medical conspiracy. His entire lucrative career had been reduced to a criminal case file on a prosecutor's desk. He would never put a stethoscope around his neck or write another prescription. The speed of it all was a powerful testament to what solid concrete evidence can do. My entire financial legacy was locked safely inside the irrevocable charitable trust. Conrad had filed the final transfer documents, cementing the corporate holding company as the permanent, unassailable owner of my estate. The immense wealth I had built across 40 years of hard physical labor was fully insulated from any future grasping hands. The state foster organization was already drawing on the initial corporate dividends to construct a large new housing facility for abandoned children in the city. They were buying warm beds and bringing in dedicated teachers for kids who had never known a safe, dependable home. I had shielded Ethan from the harsh realities of the foster system I had endured as a child. But now those same children, the ones just like the boy I had once been, would inherit the empire he had worked so hard to steal. It was the ultimate poetic balance of the universe. The money intended to fuel a vain and arrogant lifestyle was now actively securing the futures of the truly vulnerable. I took a slow sip of my tea, watching a pair of dark-eyed juncos land on the frozen bird bath in the center of the yard. I felt no sadistic joy over my son's destruction. There was no triumphant celebration, no trace of petty vindictiveness lingering in my chest. What I felt was the cold mechanical satisfaction of a veteran contractor who had identified a catastrophic structural failure and cut the rotting wood out of the foundation before it could bring the whole building down. I had spent my entire adult life constructing safe, solid structures for other peoples to live in. When I found toxic mold or severe termite damage in a main support beam, I did not feel anger toward the wood. I picked up the heavy steel saw and removed the threat before the house could collapse into rubble. Ethan was the creeping rot in my foundation. I had removed him with that exact same detached clinical precision. The natural order of my world had been fully restored. The parasites had been cut away, and the host was finally free to heal. Roy drained the last of his coffee and set the empty mug on the small iron table between our chairs. He gave me a single quiet nod, an acknowledgement of the permanent peace we had secured together. He rose slowly, pulling his thick canvas field coat tight against the biting winter wind, and made his way back toward his own property, across the frozen yard. I watched him pick his path over the icy grass, grateful for the rare loyalty of a man who knew exactly how to move through the silent, dangerous spaces of the world. I stayed in my chair and let the bright morning sun warm my face. The heavy glass door into the kitchen was cracked open just a few inches to admit the crisp air. From deep inside the quiet house, the sharp electronic ringing of the kitchen landline broke the stillness. The sound bounced off the clean butcher block kitchen island and spilled out onto the patio. I did not rush to answer it. I did not feel my heart rate climb or my muscles seize with the old reflex of paternal anxiety. I set my mug down on the table and got to my feet, slowly feeling the familiar dull ache settle into my knees. I walked calmly through the sliding glass door and stepped onto the clean hardwood floor of the kitchen. The caller identification screen on the wall phone glowed with a steady blue light in the dim room. The digital text read clearly, "The County Correctional Facility." Ethan was calling from a cold concrete block, burning his single allocated phone call to reach the man he had tried to erase. He was probably standing in a loud, crowded room, ringed by hardened strangers, terrified and completely desperate to hear a familiar voice. He wanted to beg for a high-priced attorney. He wanted to weep and manipulate and bend the truth one final time. He wanted his father to come rushing in and pull him free from the catastrophic consequences of his own actions. I stood before the ringing phone and watched the blue light pulse against the white wall. I did not sigh. I did not hesitate or feel a single flicker of paternal guilt. I reached down to the baseboard and closed my fingers around the thick plastic cord. I unplugged it directly from the wall socket. The ringing stopped instantly, and that is where the story ends. Not with a shout, not with tears, just a cord pulled from a wall and a quiet walk back to the patio. I want to sit with you for a moment in that silence. What Ethan and Tara attempted was not a crime of impulse. It was a slow, calculated dismantling of a man they assumed had nothing left to fight with. It cost me my son, or rather, it showed me clearly that the son I thought I had was never really there. That grief is real, and I will not pretend otherwise. But I believe God places the right people beside you at exactly the right hour, and Roy was beside me in those dark months. The truth has a weight to it that no forged document and no drugged bowl of stew can neutralize for long. If this story taught me anything worth passing on, it is this. First, document everything quietly and without fanfare. Evidence gathered in silence is worth more than any confrontation made in anger. Second, if someone close to you is slowly isolating you from the people who love you, treat that pattern as the warning. It is, do not explain it away. Third, protect what you have built. A will, a trust, a conversation with a lawyer. These are not cold or morbid acts. They are the most loving things you can do for the people who deserve your legacy. Fourth, love your children fiercely, but never let that love blind you to what they are actually doing. You can grieve the loss of a relationship and still hold a person fully accountable. If this story reached something inside you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. A parent, a neighbor, a friend who has been too quiet lately. And if you are not yet part of the Family Revenge Stories community, subscribe and stay close. There are more stories worth telling. Thank you for spending this time with me. Take good care of yourself and of the people who have earned it.